My name is Rebecca Caldwell, and on April 14th, 2021, my life changed forever. What began as an ordinary day turned into an experience that would completely shift my understanding of life, death, and why we face suffering. That morning, I was rushing to get things done. My daughter had an important dance recital that evening, and I was ironing her favorite purple dress while scrambling to finish a work project. I kept telling myself I'd sit down and breathe once everything was done. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp pain tore through my chest. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just stress or maybe the greasy fast food I'd grabbed for lunch. But when my arm went numb and the room started spinning, I knew this wasn't something I could brush off. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, barely managing to speak before collapsing on the floor. The last thing I remember was my golden retriever, Bailey, whimpering and nudging my face, as if she knew I was slipping away. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in my body anymore. I was floating above the room, watching everything unfold beneath me. I could see my own body lying motionless on the kitchen floor and paramedics working desperately to bring me back. One EMT was applying chest compressions, his face focused and serious, while another prepared the defibrillator. I watched as Bailey barked and struggled against my neighbor, Mrs. Duncan, who had rushed in after hearing the commotion. Despite the chaos, I felt no fear, only peace. It was as if all the worries and pain of my life had melted away. Then everything started to shift. The scene below me faded, and I felt myself being drawn upward through a tunnel of light. This light wasn't just bright, it felt alive. It wasn't blinding or harsh. Instead, it was warm and comforting, like stepping into a hug that reached straight to my soul. With every moment, I felt myself being filled with understanding, answers to questions I didn't even know I had. And then I saw him, God. He wasn't a man in robes or the image I'd imagined as a child. Instead, he was pure radiance, a presence of overwhelming love and wisdom. Without speaking, he communicated directly to my heart. He welcomed me, telling me I was between not fully in this world, yet not completely gone. Then he told me something I never expected, that he would finally answer the question I had wrestled with for so long: why good people suffer. What followed was a series of visions that revealed more than I ever thought possible. One of the first was about a young boy named Ethan. Ethan had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition and spent most of his life in and out of hospitals. His parents were devastated, yet through their pain, something remarkable happened. Ethan's father, a man who once believed he had no purpose, was inspired to start a foundation that funded heart research. That foundation would go on to save hundreds of lives, sparing countless families from the heartbreak they had endured. Watching this unfold, I realized that Ethan's suffering, while tragic, had sparked a chain of events that created hope for others. His pain became the catalyst for something extraordinary, something no one could have predicted. The visions continued, each one revealing stories of people whose suffering had somehow led to incredible change. I was shown a man named Daniel, a devoted husband who lost his wife in a tragic car accident. The grief nearly destroyed him. For months, Daniel isolated himself, drowning in pain that seemed impossible to escape. But eventually, something inside him shifted. In his darkest moments, he found the strength to reach out to others who were grieving too. He started a small support group at his church, thinking it might help just a few people. What he didn't realize was that his group would grow into something much larger, a safe space where hundreds of people found comfort and healing. Daniel's heartbreak, as unbearable as it had been, gave him the empathy and wisdom to become a lifeline for others facing similar pain. His suffering became the foundation for something that saved lives, not physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I watched as more stories unfolded before me, each one woven into the next like pieces of a puzzle. I saw a mother named Caroline who had lost her teenage son to a drunk driver. The devastation was unimaginable, and for a long time, Caroline struggled just to get through the day. But eventually, her grief pushed her to take action. She became an advocate for stricter drunk driving laws in her state. Through her efforts, new policies were put in place that would prevent future tragedies. I realized then that Caroline's suffering had transformed into a purpose that saved countless other families from enduring the same kind of heartbreak. I couldn't help but ask God, why does it have to be this way? Why can't these good things happen without the pain? In response, God showed me something I will never forget. He told me to imagine a diamond, how it starts as nothing more than a lump of dark, lifeless carbon. Only through intense pressure and heat can it become something beautiful and strong. So it is with the human soul, God explained. Without hardship, without struggle, we would never discover our true strength, our capacity to love, or the courage to create change. It was in those moments of suffering that people found their greatest purpose. God then showed me something deeply personal, my own life. I watched moments from my past replay before me, but this time, I saw them from a perspective I had never known. I saw myself as a little girl sitting beside my father's hospital bed. He had passed away after a long battle with heart disease, and I remembered the crushing pain I felt in those final moments. For years, I struggled to make sense of it. I couldn't understand why someone so kind, so loving, had to suffer the way he did. That loss stayed with me, leaving a hole I never believed could be filled. But as I watched that memory unfold, God showed me something I had never realized before, how my father's passing had shaped the person I became. Losing him gave me a deeper sense of empathy, one that allowed me to connect with others in ways I never could have otherwise. The grief that once felt unbearable had quietly molded me into someone more compassionate, someone who instinctively reached out to those carrying their own burdens of loss and heartache. The pain I once thought had shattered me had actually strengthened me in ways I never imagined. The vision shifted, and I was shown another difficult chapter of my life, a period when I struggled with intense anxiety. I remembered how overwhelming it had been, how it consumed my mind and made even the simplest moments feel impossible. There were nights I lay awake, convinced I'd never escape the fear and uncertainty that gripped me. Yet now, I was seeing that pain from a new angle. God showed me how that struggle had changed me, how it had taught me patience and understanding, not just with myself, but with others. I realized how those dark moments had softened me, making me more willing to listen, more present when friends or loved ones needed comfort. The very thing I had once begged God to take away had quietly shaped me into a better mother, a better friend, and a better person. But what struck me most was when God revealed how suffering doesn't just transform us, it connects us. I watched scenes of strangers embracing after a devastating storm, neighbors who had barely spoken before now working together to rebuild their community. I saw families sharing meals with people they once barely knew, brought together by shared loss. In those moments of tragedy, God showed me how people's differences, their race, beliefs, and social status, seemed to vanish. Pain, as cruel as it seemed, had a way of breaking down walls and forging bonds that otherwise never would have existed. Then God spoke to me directly, not with words, but in a way that filled my heart with absolute certainty. Suffering, he said, is not a punishment. It's a spark, a force that ignites compassion, resilience, and purpose. Even in your darkest moments, I am working to bring light. As those words settled in my heart, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity, like pieces of a puzzle I had struggled with my entire life were finally fitting together. But before I could fully grasp it, God showed me something that left me breathless. I was shown a man named Marcus, someone I had never met before. Marcus had spent years working at a company he loved, only to be suddenly laid off. He was devastated. Losing his job crushed his confidence, and he felt like a failure, hopeless, lost, and unsure of what his future would hold. But what Marcus couldn't see at the time was that his unemployment forced him to explore a different path. Out of desperation, he began volunteering at a local shelter, serving meals to families who had nowhere else to go. It started as something small, just a way to feel useful again, but that decision changed everything. Over time, Marcus's work at the shelter grew into something much bigger. He ended up creating a program that helped dozens of homeless families find stable jobs and housing. I watched as one of those families, a mother and her 2 children, stood on their feet for the first time in years because of Marcus's efforts. The man who once felt like his life had no purpose had unknowingly become the answer to someone else's prayer. Then I saw a woman named Melissa, a single mother who had endured an abusive relationship for years. After finally finding the courage to leave, Melissa struggled deeply with feelings of guilt and shame. She often blamed herself, convinced she had failed her children. But what Melissa couldn't see in her pain was how her strength would become an inspiration to others. She started speaking at support groups, sharing her story with women who felt just as trapped and broken as she once had. Through her courage, those women found hope, and in many cases, the strength to break free from their own situations. Melissa's suffering, though painful, became a beacon of light for others who felt lost in the darkness. I realized then that so many of the people I was being shown had no idea how powerful their stories had become. At the time of their suffering, all they could see was pain. But from God's perspective, those painful moments were planting seeds that would one day grow into something far greater than they could have imagined. As I stood there, overwhelmed by everything I had witnessed, God showed me one final vision, one that struck me deeper than anything else. I saw a young boy named Jacob. He was only 8 years old, and he had been battling a rare illness since he was a toddler. I watched as his parents sat beside his hospital bed night after night, praying for a miracle that never seemed to come. Despite his frail body, Jacob's spirit was radiant. He smiled often, laughed when he could, and never stopped showing kindness to the nurses and doctors who cared for him. I saw how his parents clung to hope, even as his condition worsened. When Jacob eventually passed away, his parents were devastated. For months, they struggled to find purpose in their lives without him. But slowly, something remarkable began to happen. His mother started volunteering at the very hospital where Jacob had been treated. She met other parents who were walking the same painful road she once had, parents who felt hopeless and afraid. Because she had lived through it herself, she knew exactly what to say, how to comfort them, and how to remind them they weren't alone. Jacob's father, once quiet and reserved, began sharing their story at local events, raising awareness for the disease that had taken his son. His efforts eventually led to increased funding for research that would one day save the lives of other children just like Jacob. Watching this unfold broke my heart, but it also opened my eyes. Jacob's life, though far too short, had created ripples that stretched far beyond what anyone could have imagined. His kindness had inspired his nurses, his courage had strengthened his parents, and his memory had sparked change that would go on to save others. What seemed like senseless suffering had, in God's hands, become something deeply meaningful, something that brought comfort, healing, and even hope. You may not always understand it now, God told me, but every life, every struggle, and every heartbreak has a purpose. Even when you can't see it, I am working through it. Nothing is wasted. In that moment, I felt a warmth surround me, a love so powerful that it seemed to fill every empty place inside me. I knew then that I wasn't alone, and that even in the pain I had faced in my own life, God had been there, quietly turning my brokenness into something greater than I could have ever imagined. As that warmth surrounded me, I felt something shifting, like I was being pulled back from this place of peace and understanding. The light that had embraced me began to fade, and the visions I'd been shown slowly disappeared. I felt my spirit being drawn back, and before I knew it, I was no longer in God's presence. I was back in my body. The first thing I heard was the sound of voices, paramedics talking to each other, their words muffled and distant. My chest ached, and my body felt weak, but I was alive. As my eyes slowly opened, I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Duncan, standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes. One of the paramedics leaned over me, his face softening with relief as he said, "Welcome back." In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I lay in my hospital bed, replaying the visions in my mind, the stories of Marcus, Melissa, Jacob, and so many others. Each one had faced incredible pain, yet somehow their suffering had given birth to something greater, something that brought healing, hope, or purpose to others. I realized that my own struggles, losing my father, battling anxiety, and facing moments of doubt and confusion, were not meaningless. They had shaped me in ways I hadn't recognized before. The kindness I'd offered to grieving friends, the patience I had learned as a mother, and even the quiet strength I had gained from my darkest moments, they all came from the pain I once wished I could erase. I don't believe God causes suffering, but I now know that He can use it, even the worst of it, to create something beautiful. Whether it's through acts of kindness, newfound strength, or the courage to reach out to someone else in pain, our suffering has a way of creating ripples that touch lives we may never even know. If you're going through something difficult right now, if you're wondering why the pain won't stop or why the storm hasn't passed, I want you to know this. God is not finished with your story. The pain you're feeling may be the very thing that shapes you into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Even if you can't see it yet, He is working in ways you can't imagine. Thank you for watching my story. If this message spoke to you, please consider sharing it with someone who may need encouragement today. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our community. Together, we can remind one another that even in life's darkest moments, there is still hope, and God is always working to bring light.